Hello, viewers, and welcome to a very special Warhammer 40,000 video production. My name is Mitch, and I am the Hive Tyrant. Today, I'm honored to present you with a very unique installment in my continuing series of Community Spotlight videos, in which I had the opportunity to sit down and interview Carl Anderton, co-host of the Traxis Sector War Cast, and engage in an introduction and rather thorough overview of the lore behind the entirety of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and the fiction in which our LCG is designed. Although this video is meant to cater specifically to players of Warhammer 40,000 Conquest, a two-player adversarial living card game produced by Fantasy Flight Games, thanks to his long history of hobbyist involvement with Warhammer, as well as his previous employment with Games Workshop, Carl is more than adequately able to provide a tremendous wealth of facts and information regarding the 40K intellectual property as a whole. Specifically, after introducing himself, he provides an overview of the Imperium of Mankind, its history as well as chaos, the Horus Heresy, and the various Xenos threats to humanity. So, if you enjoyed this video, remember to hit the like button, ensure you're subscribed, and you're encouraged to share this project, because the more engagement this video receives, the more viewers are reached, and ever the broader you help grow the Warhammer community. But, with our introduction aside, I'm honored to bring you an interview with the Traxis Sector War Cast's own Carl Anderton. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, but before we delve into the heart of our interview, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you're involved in the Conquest community?
Well, hi, I'm Carl Anderton. I'm involved with Tobin Lopez and John King on the Traxis Sector War Cast, a podcast about the 40k Conquest living card game. I currently work for the Haunted Game Cafe. I'm a game seller and coffee maker by trade at the moment. But my first form of employment was with Games Workshop. I was one of the early hobby store employees. I don't know if they do it anymore, but back when your rank was defined as by a rank of a Space Marine, which was hilarious.
That's excellent.
I was technically a Devastator Marine, if any of you know the game well. So, but anyway, that's on my old record. And I started working for them because I was a fan of a follower of the game. I played Warhammer 40,000 back in 2nd edition through 3rd.
Wow.
Which meant I was collecting and painting miniatures. I was playing the war game such as it was at the time with other people. And my first job out of I realised a large part of the people listening are going to be American, but out of the equivalent of college, my first job out of that was working for GW, and they took me on. Working in the store, you had to paint miniatures, run games, but you had to sell the hobby, as we put it. And selling the hobby was where all the knowledge comes from.
Right.
That was from reading the codexes and the army books, was understanding that you weren't selling a little metal model of a guy, you were selling a Space Marine, a superhuman warrior of the Emperor, out to fight all his enemies, all that kind of thing.
Exactly.
And that's essentially where all this came from. I realize we're doing a lore discussion today, and I always have to admit to people I have a slightly large gap in my information because I hadn't been involved in Warhammer 40,000 much for about the last 5 years or so.
Well, I think fortunately for you, Games Workshop hasn't certainly done much to advance the plot of 40k in the past 5 years.
I would have agreed until I looked in a little more and went, oh, okay, there are at least a few retcons. That I'm like, oh, really? That's been changed, has it? I will take note. But most of my basic information lines up. Since then, we've had a lot of the Horus Heresy novels from that library, which has fleshed out a lot of the early details, but not changed a whole lot. That's kind of the point of that story, really. But yeah, that's where I find myself when the Conquest living card game came up. I'd already been playing Netrunner quite a bit, and I was interested in this new one from Fantasy Flight, and found the game to be very fun, and the settings And the detail and setting presented by the new card game has been very faithful, and has also brought in interesting new characters. You know, there are familiar ones turning up like Cato Sicarius, and newer ones like Broderick War and Zaratha and such.
Well, definitely, and I very much appreciate your joining me today, Carl. I wanted to create some sort of lore-focused video just because I think a tremendous part of the appeal of this game is not just the incredibly rich strategic depth and the compelling gameplay, but really the just immensely fascinating universe that it's steeped in, and just in thinking about everyone in this community, who are these just pillars of knowledge. Listening to you on the Traxis Sector War Cast, it just seems like you just exude all of this information, and hearing you describe your history with the game, you were a hobbyist prior to actually working for the 40K Inventing Games Workshop company.
Mm-hmm.
It just seems like I can scarcely think of a better, more qualified individual than yourself to come on and represent the lore. But I suppose when it all comes down to it, why exactly do you play Conquest? Like, what's the appeal with this, and how did you get involved in podcasting for this game?
Okay, so a little bit of personal history there. My first major card game was Android Netrunner, the Fantasy Flight re-release of the original Netrunner game.
Right.
A friend of mine who I play a lot of games with brought it in one day, maybe a couple of months after the original Gen Con release. Put it down in front of me, I played this and thought, wow, I haven't encountered anything of this style. Obviously, being who I am and working for who I have done, you become involved in things like Magic the Gathering, the classic card games. And Netrunner was so different. Now, when Conquest came around, I've been playing Netrunner for some time. I'd become as competent as I'm likely to get, I think, at the game. And up popped this FFG response. I should shorten my expand my acronyms. Fantasy Flight Games announcement saying we're going to do a Warhammer 40,000 based living card game. I thought, well, because of my past history, I'll have to have a look at this. There's no two ways about it.
Right.
And getting into the game, it's interesting to see. It's an interesting midpoint. It appeals to people who like the unit-focused style of card game that Magic the Gathering popularized. It's largely about units fighting units. And then again, it's not. It's also about controlling locations, the different planets. It's about there's no automatic resources as such, or at least not enough per turn. So you're always focusing on your economy, on commanding a larger army, on controlling a board state. So it's a very interesting game. There's a little bit of randomness in there compared to most living card games, but it's enough that it keeps it interesting rather than being problematic, as it were. And then, of course, there's the fact that it's the 40k setting that I'm so familiar with, and that Fantasy Flight done a really good job of bringing that across through the game. There are older players who say like the Allies system is a bit concerning too. The idea of Imperial Guard and Orks working alongside each other is a stretch,
right.
But but still, it's that's also made its way into the most recent version of the actual tabletop game.
Sure.
So the complaint is a little by the by there. But yeah, that would be the reason I play it. It's a good meeting of a strategy game with that brutal feel that 40k has to have. The combats in the game, or the battles in the game, are always like bloody and destructive. There's rarely a planet left intact.
Right.
And yeah, it brings on this theme and this story very well.
Well, I am most definitely inclined to agree with you, and I suppose just in creating this video, it was my ultimate goal to help explain some of the just incredible lore to some players that enjoy this card game for what it is in a strategic sense, but so much of the appeal for me personally, and it sounds like for you yourself, happens to be because of the intellectual property, the grimdark, the bleakness, the incredible combats and just grand epic battles that take place. But seeing as how this is called Warhammer 40,000, everything takes place in the 41st millennium, so just in giving us a little bit of a spoiler in regard to what to expect 38,000 years from now, what exactly is humanity like? Like, what are some cultural aspects, some of their beliefs? What does humanity appear to be so far into the future?
So the vast majority of humanity in the 41st millennium forms the Imperium of Mankind. the human Imperium. It is an empire. It is nominally ruled by the Emperor, very often referred to people as the God Emperor because he's worshipped as a deity.
Right.
The humanity itself is, as a collective, it's hard to define. The setting, the conquest setting focuses on particular group of humanity, mostly through the lens of combat, of war, of armies and conflict, of course. Humanity itself is massively spread across the galaxy. It's one of the most populous races by now, holding the most space. And because of its separation, there are a lot of variations in how actually people live. And think of the variations between continents and countries on Earth, and magnify that out across an entire galaxy, billions and billions of millions of light years of distance. But they share a couple of common things. They are essentially a totalitarian state. Space fascist is one of the joke names I always remember from Games Workshop, and is honestly in some degrees is the case, at least in how they're ruled. There is one emperor. You follow him, or you follow him, shall we say? A meaningful amount of imperial authority is in maintaining that control. They are spiritual people. They believe in an imperial creed. They believe that the God Emperor watches over them and protects them all. He literally did so at one point. Whether he does so in the current timeline is something we'll brush on later, I suppose.
Sure.
They are a spacefaring race using the warp, an extra-dimensional realm for travel. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. The point is that this allows them to travel faster than light without breaking any major physical laws.
Exactly.
And enables a galaxy-wide culture to function. They also use the warp to transmit information. There is the Astronomicon, a psychic beacon emanating from Earth, from Terra, that allows them to make reasonable navigation through the warp. They also use psychers, people who are inclined towards the warp, to transmit information, again, faster than light and over distances that would be otherwise impossible. Technology has a strange place in the Imperium. There is an understanding of science, of how things function, and there is an acceptance that those things don't function unless you believe. There is literally a cult of the machine, the Adeptus Mechanicus, who are the priests of the machine god. Technically, the Emperor viewed as a provider of technology, an aspect of him. And the various people who work with technology are essentially different ranks of priesthood within the Mechanicus, from the layman, who might understand the basics of having to appease the machine spirit in a polite way before something will function, right up to the priests who develop new technology and have to appease their deity to allow these things to work. It's a good early joke I always remember from Games Workshop is that if you were to come to a cogitator, a computer, the computer might be malfunctioning. If you bang the computer on the top, it won't function. But if you say the right holy script, mark the right markings on it, and then bang out the top, it will function.
Right.
And that is a kind of, yeah.
Well, and my understanding is quite a bit of the technology is kind of like ancient, like some of the armor and technology, weaponry employed by like the Space Marines and other units and things like that are passed down, over the course of hundreds, if not thousands of years. Is there like difficulty in actually designing and developing new materials and technology?
Yes, without any doubt. That's a good point. A meaningful part of what the Adeptus Mechanicus are involved in, and humanity as a whole, is reclaiming past technology from before the before the Dark Age of technology, where humanity spread out, became separated off by major warp storms, and then started to reform. That's the Reformation, the unification of mankind, is where the Emperor comes into it as a living being, really, as we'll touch on. But yes, a lot of the really powerful technological things are treated like ancient relics. I mean, they literally are. They're rediscovered and they're subsumed back into the Imperium and made use of as best as possible. But in the way that we would treat ancient relics now, that they're badly understood. It's just that unlike in our world, when we find an ancient magical relic that's supposed to do something, it doesn't. Whereas in their case, it literally does. It's actually a piece of highly advanced technology with remarkable and sometimes dangerous powers.
Right. Well, I suppose just in regard to, this enormous sprawling Imperium spread throughout the nearly the entirety of the galaxy, we see hive worlds that have billions and billions of people. There are different planets that are kind of relegated to agriculture and all sorts of different things like that. So humanity is just spread out everywhere. And as I'm sure is abundantly clear to anyone that knows anything about Warhammer 40k or has played Conquest or anything like that, there are just myriad threats to the future of humanity. There are all sorts of, violent, invasive, encroaching alien races threatening to eradicate mankind from the presence of the galaxy. Who exactly are like the Imperial Guard, or as they're known in Conquest, the Astra Militarum? What is that faction all about?
So I will refer to them as the Astra Militarum here. I have to break a decade plus of habit of calling the Imperial Guard.
Sure.
Little cut in there. The Astra Militarum is simply the High Gothic, the Latin version of their name.
Right.
In the same way the Space Marines would be the Adeptus Astartes. Very cool name. But anyway, so the Astra Militarum, in the same way the Imperium is not necessarily particularly unified groups, the Astra Militarum is the same sort of situation. It's collectively the different military bodies that humanity employs. There are standards, of course there are. So we were mentioning earlier about the reclaimed technology, the ancient knowledge and information that humanity collects.
Right.
Part of that was something referred to as a standard template construct, which was a method of making certain pieces of technology from any available material. This leads into how the Astra Militarum operates, because the shared part of the Astra Militarum are the tactics, the methods they're expected to use. So the standard template construct allows them to co-opt local resources to produce a close enough version of the guns, the armor, the vehicles, the material they'll need to make those tactics work. And so because of that, whilst different parts of the Astra Militarum appear very different and will have variations, they follow roughly the same tactics. Those that tactics and structure would be something fairly familiar to us as modern military. They use combined arms, they have artillery support, they generally work with infantry with regular battle line weapons and things like that. There are a few strong differences. The Imperial Creed and the Imperial structure makes its way into the Astra Militarum in the form of commissars, which are, yes, based on the historical version from some of the darker times of Russia. The commissars ensure discipline, reinforce the command structure. They are not officers as such in most cases. They are political units. They're there to make sure everyone does their job and maintains belief in the structure of the Imperium.
Right.
And because of that, they are well known for the summary execution, an easy way of reinforcing the discipline of a unit that may have lost its nerve. They are normally effective warriors themselves. They're very driven, and they're to the average grunt on the ground. They're the greatest symbol of imperial authority within the ranks. And the Astra Militarum operates in all the usual functions that a modern military would be expected to follow within the structures of the Imperium Mankind, which is the idea is to spread out and conquer every single planet in existence that can be inhabited. So they can be peacekeepers, they can be literal guard forces, the planetary defense force of a certain planet. They can be expeditionary forces, they can be guarding trade routes. They're military as we would be most familiar with it, and all the stresses and dramas that comes from being one person amongst billions of armed men.
Well, and seeing as how you just mentioned how mind-boggling the sheer number of individuals composing the Imperial Guard happen to be, and the ruthlessness of the commissars, there's the stereotype being thrown around, of course, that in 40k, when the Astra Militarum happen to face a problem, you just throw as many bodies at it as you need to. 40k, just as a universe, seems so just grim and bleak and hopeless that really the value of your average human life just seems extraordinarily low. So it just seems like while the Imperial Guard might not be the most potent military force, certainly they expect, unswavering loyalty, unfailing loyalty, and just throwing enough forces at a problem until they eventually manage to surpass it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's... Without getting too philosophical about it, it's kind of a fair comment. When there's so much humanity, when there are hundreds of thousands of times more people than there are right now, what is the value of a single life versus all the various horrors we're going to describe later? I'm not morally supporting what they say, but there's an argument to understand why you would simply go, well, our biggest resource is sheer numbers of people. We have plenty of them.
Right.
We'll throw them at the problem. One of my favourite novels on the 40k setting talks about a fairly moderate leader, Ibram Gaunt from the Gaunt's Ghost novels, and he is being told about an earlier leader of men, and it's kind of a comparison between, say, modern military and 1800s Crimean War kind of tactics. I realise it's later on of that kind of style, where this leader says that he sent over 1 million men to his death in one battle, successfully taking a planet. And when asked how he felt about it, he said, "It was my pleasure and joy to have served the Imperium so well."
Right. Well, I mean, it makes me think of just the entire concept of exterminatus, like, I suppose in choosing between the lesser of two evils, exterminating some formidable, daunting, menacing alien presence could be infinitely preferable to allowing them to continue to exist, even if it means sacrificing potentially millions of lives just by eradicating the surface of the entire planet.
Yeah, exterminatus is one of those concepts that comes out of that ideal, where there are things so dangerous, so invasive, and something that can be so easily transmitted to other parts of the Imperium they're going to completely destroy it. That the honest, sensible, and bleak way to deal with it is to destroy the entire planet, essentially.
Right. Well, I suppose just in taking a look at some of the more specialized forces within the Imperium, we've touched on their culture, their belief system, the political ideologies, and I suppose it's very fair to call it, a religious set of beliefs. Who exactly are these Space Marines? Like, what are their origins, and what makes them so superhuman? How come they're like the kind of forefront, the showpiece of 40k?
So the Space Marines, the Adeptus Astartes, those who are adept at being immortal. It's a wonderful set of information about them. In the same way the Astra Militarum and the Imperial Guard. The Space Marines are the best of the best. In our current day, that would mean the best training, the best equipment, the best information and tactics. The Space Marines are beyond that. They're genetically engineered super soldiers in the literal sense. Their origin is something called the Primarch Project, which we'll get into a little bit more. They were the first pinnacle of genetically engineered design, essentially. And each of the Primarchs have certain traits that are passed down to the various Space Marines that come from their line, as it were. A Space Marine themselves starts out as a regular human, normally a particularly skilled, particularly gifted and talented individual as a combatant, who is heavily modified. There is a particular organ referred to as the gene seed, a controlling thing that enables the body to control and handle all the various genetic changes that are put upon it. That essential gene seed is really what makes up the Space Marines. It's such an important thing that parts of each Space Marine chapter, their division, are dedicated to retrieving this from a dead Space Marine. It's a resource that's almost entirely finite. It's very hard to reproduce. It allows a Space Marine to have things such as their massive bulk and physique, their speed and agility. It allows them to have a entirely fused rib cage. There are no gaps in the Marine's rib cage, it's essentially armor under the skin. It enables them to have blood that forms something called cinnabar, a hard ceramic substance that clots almost instantaneously on contact with the air, so they're very hard to make bleed, and they heal ridiculously quickly. They have all sorts of little in some ways, Space Marines can kind of resemble a piece of programming that's been worked on over time. There are odd things in their construction, such as the ability to spit acidic poison.
Right.
I'm assuming at some point this was seen as a helpful tool, and the novels and stories like to bring up that it's hard to trap a Space Marine since they can literally chew through iron to escape from captivity and things like this.
Right.
But there's a variety of functions here. Added on top of that, you have a science fiction staple, the power armor, servo-assisted, heavy armored vehicle level plating, coating them from head to toe, with various forms of high-end technology inside their headsets, inside their helmets, giving them battle awareness, giving them high-level communications, targeting assist, things like that. Add to this the weapon they carry as a mainline weapon is something called a bolt gun. The bolter shells they fire have a real-life analog, actually, gyrojet ammunition, a a guided small missile, essentially a rocket fired from the weapon. These are huge. I've seen a couple of recreations, actually. I've been to the Games Workshop headquarters in Nottingham, and I've seen a few of the real-size recreations of these things, and modern calibers don't really match. These are like the things fired from an autocannon, rather than from any human-held weapon. One of the classics of that is that mass reactive. They hit a body, penetrate inside, become aware they're inside something, and then explode. So the lethality is extremely high. Add all of this together, and you have a warrior that is almost incomparable. And then on top of all that, you can add the culture of the Imperium. Essentially, the Space Marines are monastic warriors. They're warrior monks, not so different from, say, the legendary version of the Shaolin. They do nothing but live in groups amongst themselves, train to fight, consider their position in the Imperium as holy warriors, as defenders of mankind, and they're sent out to fight and to die from the Imperium for the entirety of their lives.
Right. I mean, I've definitely heard that it's a little bit difficult to write fiction for 40K sometimes, just because if an author wanted to write something from the perspective of a Space Marine, their entire existence is so focused on either battle or training to fight that they essentially exclude anything and everything else. It's all just war and fighting and just violence in their existence. Like they're very much constructs bred and designed and created for one specific purpose, and that's to promote the interests of mankind, I suppose.
One of my favorite pieces of writing involving them is the big tragedy that in the Horus Heresy novels, back when the Imperium is a little bit more in tune with modern ideals in terms of what they've looked at,
right.
They have the introspection to realize that if a Space Marine was not sent into combat, there's a very good chance that the changes that have been made to him would make him functionally immortal. Except his destiny is to die in battle. Every Space Marine eventually dies in battle.
Well, and certainly you'll hear ever so often about, say, a chapter master that's something like 1,000 years old or something absolutely absurd like that. But I suppose earlier you happened to mention like the Primarch project, and all of that, of course, happens to stem from the aforementioned God Emperor of mankind. So there's the cult of the Imperium. There's all of this, deity worship, all based on one, albeit difficult to conceptualize, individual. But what exactly was the origin of the Emperor? Like, is he a he? Is there a corporeal, physically manifest being, or is it actually a god? Like, what are the origins of the Emperor, and kind of what, as a being, is he all about?
So this is where the knowledge I picked up playing the game hits some of the newer ideas. So I'm kind of going to brush over the actual Emperor's origin, because there's a bit of dispute about that in the storyline, as it were.
Sure.
Honestly, where he actually came from doesn't matter too much. What matters is that during a period known as the Age of Strife, I want to take a rough estimate of something in the late to mid 20,000s for Earth, something in that realm, approaching the 30,000, the 31st millennia. A human being emerged on Earth. He had psychic powers beyond anything else we can possibly conceive. Essentially godlike, near immortal, charismatic, able to protect himself and to lead men in a way that had not been encountered before. And he reunified the planet for the first time in millennia, in tens of millennia. He pulled together various warlords and groups and unified Terra into one force. This was unprecedented, a new thing for the time, as it were. And he had a vision. The vision was that humanity should spread to the stars. Now, previously, around the start of the Age of Strife, I want to say, humanity had indeed spread out. It had become a spacefaring race. It had gone system to system and gone out into the galaxy. And then great warp storms came down around the start of Age of Strife. I should clarify, disturbances that meant that people couldn't travel from planet to planet effectively, or travel from system to system. I should make that clear. They couldn't get between different stars. And so humanity got separated off. So when, after the Emperor had quickly and efficiently conquered and unified Earth, he wanted to reunify the entirety of humanity into one great Imperium, to form one great group. He sees that as their great destiny, as the future and the fate of humanity was to rule the galaxy. So with this ideal in mind, he set out. Now, he needed warriors. He had started to develop the ideals of the ideas of genetically engineering men intended only to fight, to be the best warriors they can in the unification wars. He took that a step further. He realized that he needed something else like himself. He couldn't be everywhere. He needed leaders, generals, to operate in his stead in different areas. So he started to develop the idea of the primarchs, demigod-like creatures. Humans developed from him to share his power, to share his strength, his charisma, his ability to lead, and to take his genetic material in the way of less of a clone and more of a son, to take that and develop and grow in their own way.
Right.
These are all the intended ideals of the primarchs. Now, we haven't really talked much about Chaos. We'll touch on that later on, but it's enough to say that Chaos was a force that at this time got involved and scattered the early primarchs as very young children, I think as almost as babies, to various different parts of the galaxy as part of a long-term plan that will become evident. This led to the different primarchs growing up on different human worlds, being coloured by that growth, adopting some part of the culture and the nature of the planets themselves. We mentioned, I think, well, Horus is a classic example. Horus ended up on a Chthoniya, a hive world. You mentioned an industrial hellhole, really.
Right.
A place where the warriors and the men there were tough, were expected to live short lives, be stoic, nasty fighters. And he grew up amongst that as a prodigy. The primarchs, all of them as developed, were just the most remarkable people, appearing to the people on the planet to be as remarkable as the Emperor would to the people on Earth. And as the Emperor started to spread out from planet to planet, he found his lost sons, his primarchs, and he called them into the fold. The interesting part was that in their absence, he'd continued to develop the Primarch project, taking the various genetic samples he had from them to make the first gene seed. From those gene seed were the original Space Marine legions. That's from which they were founded. So as the Emperor spread out with these new warriors, all of them taking on a little bit of the facet of the different Primarchs, and so colouring their growth, their development, their idiosyncrasies. The Space Marine legions had the kind of like, bizarre revelation of meeting their makers, meeting the people from whom they were born, and accepting them as leaders and bringing them into their fold, as it were. And so at this point now, around the 31st millennium, the Emperor had a group of different Space Marine legions led by Primarchs who embodied both parts of him and the best factors of those particular legions, and started to spread out across the galaxy with amazing speed in relative terms, unifying huge swaths of humanity. And then we get into Chaos rearing its head. Chaos is most commonly known as a corruptive force, and in the same way that the Primarchs exemplified the best parts of the Emperor, they took on both some of his worst parts and the human frailties of their own. They became jealous. They were brothers in the end. They bickered and fought between each other, and they led millions of the most powerful troops, most powerful warriors that have ever existed. And Chaos accelerated this process, taking the Emperor's favoured son, Horus, and his legion, the Lunar Wolves, later the Sons of Horus, and a rough split of about half of the legions, and encouraging them and driving them on towards betraying the Emperor, deciding they should be in charge. A big factor of this was the Emperor retired from the Crusade, leaving Horus as the War Master, leaving him to operate in his stead. This founded jealousy and discontent amongst the groups. But what it boils down to is that the legions separated roughly down the middle between the traitors and the loyal. There was the huge, horrifying war known as the Horus Heresy, the big heretical betraying by Horus, which culminated in Horus trying to besiege Terra. In orbit over Terra on a battle barge, a massive battleship, Horus had been bombarding the planet and trying to invade the Imperial Palace. The Emperor took matters into his own hands, teleported aboard the barge itself, and killed Horus, and Horus mortally wounding the Emperor in response. The heresy was ended. The various traitor marines retreated to basically align themselves fully with Chaos and to mostly disappear from the physical universe, heading off into the warp itself. The Emperor returned to Earth, mortally wounded, and was fitted into the Golden Throne, a stasis device intended to keep him, to prevent him from dying. Whether he's alive or not as such is a debatable point. whether he's dead or not, I suppose, is a debatable point as well. We mentioned the Astronomicon, a psychic beacon, earlier on. He was always the essential point of that, and him being in the Golden Throne allows the Imperium to continue to operate. It gives them the psychic navigation point that allows navigators to navigate safely through the warp.
Right.
And so you have this corpse emperor, this deity in physical form that people believe and follow the strictures of, and leaving behind the High Lords of Terror, a council which now rules the Imperium. The primarchs themselves, either in the form of the traitor ones, have either disappeared off into the warp somewhere and are treated more like demon princes and monsters, or almost all of them have passed away or faded off from the setting, as it were, over the 10 millennia between that time. Robert Gilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, is famously known to be in a similar state to the Emperor. He was mortally wounded by a demon and is held in stasis on Ultramar in a shrine built to his honor. One of the little hinted plot points I've always seen is that supposedly over the last couple of hundred years his wounds have been seen to be healing, although nothing further has come of that in the plot line. And so you have this current situation of the Space Marines themselves, who we should make clear. One of the interesting parts about the current setting is that the Marines are separated out into smaller chapters. This is largely down to the idea that no one man should command the power of a full legion, after the heresy showed how dangerous that would be.
Certainly.
And so we now have the smaller tiny separations of, I want to say, 1,000 Marines normally forms a chapter.
Yeah.
In the regular rate, there are quite a few that oppose that ideal. The Black Templars, for example, are a non-codex chapter.
Right.
They have their own different formation. But there we are.
Right. And I mean, just in, certainly that was a very nice, succinct summary of this incredible period of upset in the history of humanity where, the division of the Primarchs, something like 20 different individuals that were all conceived and engineered by the Emperor to really command his forces were split in half, essentially divided amongst one another, just probably, I suppose the amount of time eludes me, but whether it was tens of years or hundreds of years of just vicious, brutal bloodshed, all kind of culminating with Horus facing down the Emperor. And of course, the Emperor was unwilling to outright murder one of his sons that had fallen to such corruption. So just that tremendous fight in the atmosphere or orbit around Terra, all kind of culminating in this tragic downfall of someone who in the Horus Heresy novel series was once portrayed to be so identifiable and empathetic and just, and it's really just a tragic, I think, downfall really. But if a Space Marine seems like a god to a normal soldier within the Imperial Guard, the Primarchs seem like gods in a sense to the Space Marines, and then the Emperor himself is of course a cut above that. And my understanding is that even though the Emperor isn't necessarily a physically functioning being at this point, just kind of confined to that Golden Throne, he's still very much a formidable psychic presence that is still doing so much to help protect humanity from the encroaching forces of chaos. I suppose just really the last thing I wanted to ask before we touch on chaos and the warp, the immaterium, demons, all sorts of different subjects like that, what exactly was the Emperor's thought process in wanting to purge the galaxy of alien life?
There's a fun one. I think it really comes down to that totalitarian nature I mentioned earlier, that the Emperor simply believes that humanity is the only race that deserves to inherit the galaxy, as it were. That they are the most pure form of life, that they're the most noble, the most deserving of that nature. He looked at the other races and saw the decadent Eldar, who then closed themselves away and were aloof and uninterested in the rest of the galaxy. You have brutal races such as the Orks. At that time, you wouldn't have encountered the Tyranids, but the Tyranids would have reinforced his view that other life forms were simply awful things that shouldn't exist, that were only ever going to be destructive to themselves and to other parts of the galaxy.
Sure.
So really, it comes down to this idea of that humanity is destined to rule everything, and that they are the best thing for the galaxy overall. And I would like to believe, I think there's some hint in the early Horus Heresy novels and some of the other stories that at the very, very first point, some parts of the Empire and of the Imperium and the Emperor himself would have been willing to align and to make allies with other Xenos races, with other alien races, but that simply it never worked. That the Imperium's ideals and the humans' ideals were always so at odds with those races that the only end result was conflict.
Right.
And so as far as the Imperium was concerned, the only way to solve that problem was to remove them from existence in the long term.
Well, and certainly there are these tremendous themes throughout the 40k lore of wanting to preserve humanity at any and all costs, to unify, to come together under one creed, under one system of beliefs, even though there's myriad different cultures composing humanity. When it all comes down to it, kind of self-preservation seemed to be the ultimate goal for the Emperor and for the Imperium, to destroy heretics, to destroy aliens, and probably the biggest threat posed to humanity, and of course this is entirely debatable, but especially prominent during the Horus Heresy period, and is, rather nicely depicted in dozens of novels that are at this point still ongoing. The biggest threat, when it all comes down to it, appears to be chaos. Earlier you touched on the warp, but what exactly is the Immaterium? How is chaos physically manifest? How is it psychically manifest? Kind of what exactly is this difficult to describe, tricky to conceptualize evil demonic presence out there in the universe?
Excuse me. This is one of my favorite parts about the 40k setting. I have a joke comment that is only that is mostly serious. That is, Warhammer 40,000 is modern sci-fi Lovecraft. It's cosmic horror,
right?
And the warp is the definition of that. The idea of the warp is it's an alternate dimension, a different realm, a different place. It's formed of energy that is literally antithetical, that is in opposition to the forces that form our physical universe. The rules that we're used to don't apply there at all, and that energy can manifest itself in psychic power in various different races within the physical world who can interact with this thing. They are beacons within it. They're more visible in that realm than any other life form, and they can use this. How can I put it? The energy within the warp is a force of change. As far as we're concerned, it modifies things. It can change the physical rules. It can change the nature of matter of the existence. And psychers can use this. The people who are psychically active and can link to the warp through their mind can change our world, normally in the simplest way of destroying things, but they can corrupt and modify it. Now, as I said before, the warp doesn't operate on the same physical rules we're familiar with. So one of the things that can happen is that travel through the warp can start in one place in the physical world. You can enter into the warp by breaching the barrier between them, travel some distance through the warp, and emerge a immensely greater distance away, essentially traveling faster than light.
Right.
So the ability to go between systems, the capacity to travel between star systems and to voyage across the galaxy is only possible in the 40k setting because of the warp, because of the ability to go into it. Now, the problem is, as you said, is that the warp is this huge changing void of energy. If it was simply that, it would be dangerous. There's more going on. The connection between those who are psychically active is simply the pinnacle, the high point of the way that the various sentient races interact with the warp. The warp has a consciousness of its own. It has small individual ones ranging to maybe an overall consciousness of its own. It resents physical life entering it. Voyaging through the warp is rather like a submarine going through the deepest part of the ocean, and the various life forms there banging on the hull and creaking and pressuring against it, trying to get at the people inside. Again, this would be dangerous enough were they simply animals, maybe just investigating something passing through. They're not. They're malignant. They're what we would consider evil. They're destructive, and they want to consume life. Which is where we come on to chaos. Chaos really, I suppose, is the definition of that intelligence, of that evil, destructive, malign intent. Giving it a name is kind of to take away a little bit of its power almost, because it's so wide-ranging and so awful and alien to us. In the same way, the Imperium identifies different, what it's not happy to call gods, different deities, points of power within chaos. Three major ones would be Khorne, Nurgle, and Tzeentch. Khorne is in some way the simplest of them all. It's a destructive force of slaughter. The line that turns up on a couple of new cards coming up for the Conquest game is Blood for the Blood God, and they get the second one wrong. It's Skulls for the Throne of Khorne, not Skulls for the Skull Throne. Don't let anyone tell you. So Khorne is the god of berserkers. The various demons, smaller intelligences, smaller entities of the same form that come out, are all demons of slaughter and war. They're all melee weapon-wielding forces of destruction that do nothing but carve through their opponents. Then you have Nurgle. Nurgle is the god of pestilence, the plague deity. His essence is that of all the various horrible diseases of corruption and entropy that we're so familiar with. He wants nothing but to spread disease and filth across the entirety of the galaxy. He lives in a strange state that anything he infects becomes more undead, in our viewpoint. It continues to exist, just in this awful, half-alive, collapsing form, and that's his view. His view is that's how all life should exist. I do like Nurgle because he's portrayed in a sort of semi-cheerful way, of happily passing out his diseases and plagues and looking after his underlings in quite a fatherly kind of manner. In fact, I believe, if I remember correctly, the various demons refer to him as Father Nurgle.
Right, the Plague Father.
Exactly so, yes.
And Kugoth, as we see represented in our card game, is actually an element of Nurgle's corporeal, physically manifest body. I forget if it's actually like discarded, or if it is somehow spawned off, or in part a production of some sort of like putrefied concoction of just vileness and disease, but he's actually like part of a chaos god in a sense.
Well, I think that's true of any of the various demons. The definition of demon would be part of the greater, seriously, psychic body, as it were, of the various deities.
Sure.
Kugoth, it's worth noting, is a greater demon, so he in some way supposedly embodies a vision of Nurgle himself. If anyone was to view what Nurgle itself appears like, it would be the various greater demons. I think we've had him and a Slaanesh one so far in terms of art depicted in the setting, so that will give you an idea of what they look like. If you could if you could imagine being able to literally envision a godlike being.
Right.
Yeah. Then we have Tzeentch. Zarathur is a follower of Tzeentch, wonderfully difficult name to pronounce, which is the god of change. This is the essence of the literally warping part of the warp, as it were. The way that mutability, of changeability, of randomness, of the awful lack of fixed form that the warp has. He has his Flamers of Tzeentch, which are strange, shifting, changing creatures. And Tzeentch is also known as the fortune tellers, the seers, warp power. Those psychers who have some idea of seeing the future are doing it through Tzeentch's power. And that also nicely kind of narratively links into the idea that the future is not set. Tzeentch is something who understands innately the idea of changeability and variability, can conceive of this idea of a future that does exist but might not, and all the various different ones that could involve that. He is in some way one of the more corruptive ones. Nurgle turning up on a planet is fairly clear. Everyone gets sick and starts to die. Khorne, the influence of Khornate demons turning up on a planet is fairly clear. Battle breaks out.
Right.
Tzeentch is the insidious cult leader. He's the one who changes minds first, more than he changes bodies or particularly changes outward behavior. He is the insidious one that can cause some of the greatest problems for the Imperium because it's so hard to root out his effects until it's too late. And we also have Slaanesh, which is one we might touch on a little bit more detail later on. But him, her, it. Honestly, there's a bit of debate and unclearness about that, since Slaanesh, I'll use the term, is the god of pleasure and pain, of all the awful debaucheries that living creatures can inflict on each other and can indulge in. And because of that, he's also another corruptive influence, another insidious force, although in probably in far less savoury ways than Tzeentch is, to be honest. You have his demonettes that are somewhat feminine-appearing demons that take their pleasure out of torturing people.
Right.
We have the Keeper of Secrets, the idea that Slaanesh understands the darker parts of living creatures' souls better than anyone else. He's the one who knows what darkness resides in the heart of men, kind of thing, and things like that.
Exactly, and I just, in portraying all of the different Chaos Gods, I've been nothing but impressed with how the various authors within the Horus Heresy have managed to kind of characterize some of these presences. Like zombies are so played out and cliche in popular culture, but just the manner in which some of these authors can construct a narrative based around just these essentially unstoppable, immortal undead forces that just ooze pestilence and disease and infection. It's just so disgusting yet oddly fascinating and appealing that I just cannot help but, not put down the novel and the fall of a specific primarch fulcrum to the corruptive forces of Slaanesh, just in considering how all-encompassing, pleasure and pain and sensation-seeking and all of these different things can be. It's just been an absolutely incredible bit of reading, and Angron, one of the primarchs of what becomes the Traitor Legion, the World Eaters, just the rage and brutality and bloodthirsty nature, it's just absolutely ensorceling. It's very difficult to put these books down, but in kind of bringing this interview to somewhat of a close, we've spoken at great length about the Imperium. We've touched on chaos, what exactly those corruptive and powerful demonic supernatural forces are. What about some of the other Xenos races? So you mentioned earlier the Eldar. They're quite sophisticated, they're refined. Who exactly are they, and what is their relationship with humanity and chaos?
So the Eldar, we kind of have to break into three rough definitions. Essentially, we technically have the Craftworld Eldar, the Exodite Eldar, or the Maiden World Eldar, and the Dark Eldar. They were all once one race. In the same way that the Imperium is striving to conquer the whole galaxy, essentially it's been done before. At one point, the Eldar were the pinnacle of civilization across the galaxy. As a species, they are Tolkien's elves. They're the epitome of what a intelligent race can achieve. They're fast and strong, intelligent, brightly burning, passionate creatures, passionate living beings. Their biggest strength and their biggest weakness is that they seem to feel things far more strongly than most other races. Their joys are the most ecstatic of joys, and their lows are the worst of the NY you can possibly imagine. This is really what led to their downfall. Their technological level became so high historically that they didn't need to work. That parts of the Eldar, the vast majority of the Eldar race, didn't have to do anything. They could be completely indolent and relaxed. They had developed machinery to sustain their lifestyle pretty much indefinitely. This and the combination of their the strong emotions they feel led to large parts of them becoming debauched, to exploring pleasure, exploring how much they could enjoy their existence over millennia. Parts of the Eldar race realized this was a dreadful idea, that this could only lead to bad things happening, became disgusted what the Eldar race was turning into. The first ones to do this, the ones known as the Exodites, they became pilgrims. They headed out to newly colonized, fresh planets on the outskirts of Eldar civilization known as the Maiden Worlds, and they set themselves to a kind of sort of puritanical existence, one held away from the rest of the species, living in as best they balanced with nature as they could. Shortly after that, you have the Craftworld Eldar, those who realized how bad a collapse was approaching culturally as they saw it within the Eldar race. They built these kind of space stations or ark vessels, the Craftworld, massive constructed ships that headed out into the depths of space. They themselves turned to an ascetic lifestyle. They realized that the worst excesses of their species had to be controlled, and that they should devote themselves to a particular path to help avoid that kind of thing. If you look at the Eldar, the most of the time in the game when we encounter Eldar, those are Craftworld Eldar. So they are normally focused to one particular type of lifestyle. You'll see the aspect warriors, who are military units who are focused on a particular martial style, like martial artists in our setting. They've chosen a way of fighting and embody that and nothing but that. And so these people spread out to escape what was coming. However, they couldn't know how bad what was coming was. Around this time, the aristocracy of the remaining debauched Eldar had taken up residence in something called the Webway. This was a construct of passageways network of tunnels through the warp. It was their way of traveling from place to place. They had become aware of the dangers of encountering the warp and how unpleasant it can be to travel through it in a ship, and so had literally built physically maintained passageways through this whole thing. Big enough, some of them small enough for people to walk through, some of them big enough for ships to pass through. Well, as I say, the particularly debauched aristocracy of the remaining Eldar retired to a huge confluence, a nexus point of the webway, a massive place where they could live in a huge city there, and continue to do the awful things they'd done to each other, perpetrating their pursuit of pleasure and pain, which might sound familiar when we mentioned one of the Chaos Gods a little while back.
Right.
Well, this came to a head. The awfulness of what they were doing had an effect on the warp. As we said before, the warp in some way reflects facets of the living creatures of the galaxy, and their horrors created a new god. At the time, there were 3 known Chaos Gods. The awful things they did created Slaanesh. Slaanesh's birth was a explosive psychic shockwave that devastated the vast majority of the Eldar species, removed almost all of its civilization from space. There were 3 surviving groups: the Exodites on the far outer edge on the Maiden Worlds, those craft worlds that had got far enough away to survive, not all of them, and the awful aristocracy of the Eldar hidden away in the webway, separated from the warp. Now, none of them got away unscathed, as it were. When living creatures die, their souls pass into the warp in some way. This is just an accepted fact, as it were.
Sure.
The Imperium's not happy about it, with the nature of the warp, but such is the existence of things. They believe that the Emperor takes them to a safe place there and guards and protects them, which is entirely reasonable in their belief system. The Eldar know a horrible fact. When they die and go into the warp, Slaanesh, their souls belong to Slaanesh. The curse that those debauched Eldar put upon them is simply that fact. So the Exodites and the Craftworld Eldar both employ a similar system. They maintain their souls in different methods of storage, essentially. The Craftworld Eldar particularly operate with spirit stones. If you look at any Eldar depiction, you'll see these gems carefully inlaid into their armor, into amulets, into decorative parts of their clothing. These stones are a repository for a past dead Eldar. The soul has been kept here safe rather than ending up in the warp to be consumed by Slaanesh. The various aspect warriors, for example, literally share that armor with the past psyches of ancient Eldar warriors. Hence the reason they can grow and build from that power. There are particularly powerful aspect warriors known as Phoenix Lords. Baharoth is a Phoenix Lord. And the idea is that his armor has collected so many spirit stones and taken on so many different warriors that there may not be a person inside that could be called Baharoth, that he is more of a gestalt entity made up of all that past knowledge.
Wow.
But that's a kind of a side point of the whole thing. All the Phoenix Lords operate like that. I can't wait to see more. They're great iconic parts of the setting.
Well, most definitely. And I imagine that things like Wraith Knights happen to function similarly, where it's like the spirit of an Eldar that's actually driving this mechanical construct.
Exactly so, yes. Wraith Knights do not have any living creature inside them. You're quite right. They're a byproduct of the problem that the Eldar race is dying out, that there are tiny amounts of them. So Wraithguard and Wraith Knights are a way of taking a spirit stone from a previously deceased Eldar and basically increasing your numbers on the front line.
Right.
Making warriors that you couldn't otherwise sustain the numbers of.
Right, and I suppose that's similar yet also radically different than something like we've seen Dreadnoughts incorporated into this game, which is essentially like a mortally or critically wounded space marine confined within a giant mechanical combat apparatus in order to continue fighting against the enemies of mankind. In regard to the it seems like inevitable extinction of the Eldar, is it just that they're so few in number now that they're dwindling and dying out, or is there anything more sinister than that?
That essentially is it. I mean, the Eldar are living in a galaxy that is in opposition to them. There are races that remember how they were. There may even be races, smaller races within the setting that know what they did, as it were, and encountered them. The Imperium is in opposition with them. The Eldar are proud. They don't want to ally themselves in a particular way with other species. So slowly, these ascetic, aloof creatures are dying out. They themselves maintain larger versions of those spirit stones called infinity circuits within their craft worlds. That essentially is the closest thing that a normal Eldar will experience to an afterlife, a shared existence of their soul with the other souls of their race that have passed away here. But that leads to a problem. the destruction of that craft world destroys literally their ancestors.
Right.
So the Eldar are in this twilight of their species, as it were. And then we pass on to those aristocrats we mentioned earlier. They are the Dark Eldar. They were already torturers, sadistic murderers, awful excuses for living creatures before Slaanesh emerged. When Slaanesh emerged, they realized that their souls belonged to it. And while they're living in the webway, they're closer to the warp than most of Eldar, and so they could essentially be aware of their souls slowly being drained away by Slaanesh little by little, rather than being claimed in one go. They then realized that by essentially doing Slaanesh's bidding, going out and creating more suffering, more pain, more debauchery, they could stave off this loss. So they are a species entirely dedicated to pirate raids out of the various parts of the webway they control, to taking captives and slaves, and to inflicting as much suffering on the rest of existence as they possibly can, selfishly to sustain their own existence.
Wow.
Yeah.
They sound like just a fantastic species, truly the pinnacle of sophistication and cultural refinement.
As a little aside, I don't know whether you'll put this bit out, but whenever Games Workshop has come to look at how it can spread its IP out a little more, Dark Eldar is the one that gets watered down more.
Exactly. Rumors have abounded lately. Is Games Workshop going to kill Slaanesh? And
that's the Age of Sigmar related stuff. Without getting into this, but yeah, they have played down the presence of Slaanesh in the successor to Warhammer Fantasy Battle.
Most definitely.
I don't think they can pull it out of 40k successfully. It's too well embedded, but they've definitely gone, this is not really something we can sell people these days. So anyway,
it's definitely not one of the most family-friendly aspects of the hobby for sure. But now that we've touched on the wonderful Eldar, the Dark Eldar, we've covered Chaos, the Imperium of Mankind, there are still just a few miscellaneous factions present within the universe to touch upon. Certainly there are countless alien species out there, but some of the most distinct groups, some of the largest clusters of alien life. One of them happens to be the Orks. So they're a very strange collective of individuals. What exactly are the Greenskins?
Okay, the Orks. So, one of the fun bits about the Orks is that they're a species that if they ever got their act together and organized themselves, they would conquer the whole galaxy.
Right.
They are almost definitely the most numerous species out there, period. They definitely outnumber humanity. They possibly even match or outnumber things like the Tyranids, we'll come to later on, a swarm race. They are creatures that are bioengineered to fight, kind of like the Space Marines. A particularly ancient race, the Great Old Ones, who seem to have factored into a lot of the early history, the really, really early millions of years ago history of the galaxy. And they made these guys to fight. In fact, they made them to fight one of the alien races, and their leaders we'll mention later, the Necrons. But they developed this species. They're a symbiotic life form. They're somewhat animal as we understand it, mixed in with fungal aspects. They themselves are brutish, warlike individuals. They are big, tough, somewhat slow of thinking, hulking creatures. You refer to them as greenskins. They're orcish in the typical sense, massive tusks, huge muscular physiques. They form clans and battle each other. They have a strange instinctive understanding of certain forms of technology. Technology in terms of making things work well enough for themselves. Apparently, this is a recent discovery, one for myself, they have certain instinctive ideas coded into their genetic structure to make them work. There are members of their species that have technological knowledge coded into their genes, so they have an instinctive understanding of how to make machinery work. And all they do is fight. All they want to do is fight. They fight. If they fight every alien race, they fight humanity. When there's none of those around, they fight each other, which is the major reason they haven't yet conquered the entire galaxy. Individually, Orks are powerful themselves, are strong, muscular, tough warriors. Not particularly bright. Their leaders can show a certain amount of impressive cunning, normally without much thought of the long term. Again, a major reason they haven't really spread very far.
Right.
As a species, they reproduce in a way that makes them very problematic. They shed spores like you and I shed skin cells. These spores will land upon the ground, upon soil, and basically grow a mushroom. This mushroom will grow a root system that essentially is a sort of womb for an orcoid life form. Orcs themselves, the warrior units the setting most often sees, are not the only orcoid life form. All the other things around them are essentially other creatures part of the same ecosystem. The snotlings, the squigs, the various things like that, the squigoffs and so on and so forth. All of these are bred from the same method. These spores will shed down, and essentially, depending on what the situation is for the species, will produce different parts of that ecosystem. Normally, the squigs first, then the snotlings, who can live off them by farming them, and then finally the orcs themselves will start to grow. This means that when orcs invade a planet, they're insanely difficult to get rid of, because every single orc you kill sheds some extra spores and grows more orcoid life forms. So they're infective in this way. They have a strange psychic presence. No one orc is psychically powerful, but communally they form strong psychic abilities. There are two factors to this. One of them is the strange fact that their psychic powers can cause certain racial beliefs they have to be true. Such as orcs believe that red ones go faster,
right.
referring to their vehicles. So that if they paint their vehicles red, their vehicles will be quicker, be faster, more agile. As their collective psychic belief in this makes that the fact. If they paint their vehicles red, their vehicles work better. They have yellow. The Flashgits use yellow armor to make their weapons better. Supposedly because they're up in this particular impressive yellow garb, they'll be better at shooting. And this psychic collective makes this be the fact. The other part of this psychic power is something referred to as the warg. Honestly, the warg is used to refer to a few different things in orc culture, but in this case, it's the collective psychic ability they have. Old Zogwart is a weird boy, a particularly powerful psyker in his own sense, someone who can draw on that power of his fellow orcs and turn it into magic. In his case, producing snotlings from nowhere and calling upon different things like that. The Squigify ability is a manifestation of the warg, being able to reshape reality in these strange ways, merely because orcs believe it will work. Also, an orc warg can refer to a particular leader unifying a number of tribes and sending them off in something in between a migration and a holy war, where they storm out across the galaxy and conquer new land. And then, fortunately, they get bored of expanding, stop, fight each other, until the cycle repeats itself.
Right. Well, I suppose just to kind of round things out and touch on some of the other remaining races, what about the Tau? They're kind of a collective of different species, like the Fire Warriors, the Kroot, the Vespid. They're somewhat of kind of an amalgam or covenant or group of different races all kind of working together and somewhat unified. What's the story with them?
The Tau are kind of... the Tau to me are what we would do if we were the Imperium in 40k. They are a somewhat upstart race. They're relatively young as far as other races are concerned. There's a great story in their setting of the Empire passing by a planet and seeing these hunter-gatherers working in packs, these little grey-skinned humanoids running around throwing spears at oxen kind of thing. And then they come back a relatively short time later, I forget, maybe a couple of thousand years, something like that most, and all of a sudden they're a higher technology level than the Imperium. So they develop quickly. They live relatively short lives, and they're not to misuse the term, they're a communist people. They believe in an ideal that everyone should work towards as a whole, the greater good. They refer to it literally. I believe the word Tau refers directly to that, in fact. I forget exactly. Now, because with that ideal in mind, they believe that they are, just like humanity, they are the most important, the best race around. But rather than we should wipe out all other alien races, they believe that other races can benefit from their ideal, that they can share in the greater good. So as you said, you have the Kroot warriors, a bird-like warrior mercenary species that operate with them, the Vespid that are insectoid-like. There is a little bit more going on the Vespid. There's a suggestion that the Tau are quietly controlling them with these helmets that are supposed to augment their abilities. So the Tau aren't all nice, but there's an idea that the initial control over them has been gained through these psychic devices.
Well, and I certainly believe one of the things that's maybe changed a little bit since you've been, most involved in 40k lore is just a growing sense of being a sinister presence to the Tau. Like, initially it seemed as though they were almost too good to fit into the rest of the grimdark, nasty 40k setting. So there have been a few tweaks here and there to the lore, is my understanding, to make them seem less like the good guys.
Not to get off point, I felt it was always entirely unnecessary. You need to have some I don't think they were much of a good guy in the first place. They were only a good guy by the standards of 40k.
Sure.
And you need to have good guys to show what the bad guys are like. The Imperium are technically the good guys. So that shows you how bad the Dark Eldar and the Chaos have to be to appear as bad guys, you know. But yeah, the Tower are interesting because they have a caste system. They breed true different functions within their society. So if you're an Earth caste member, you're born to be an Earth caste member. You're born to be a technician. You have a predilection for it. You have a slightly different physical structure. The Air caste members, their pilots, for example, are light-boned, ethereal. Supposedly, originally, they had wings. That's why they understood how to fly, and they've slowly had them devolve into vestigial parts of their physiology. You have the ethereals, who possess a third eye and have a inbuilt genetic, poorly understood ability to lead and to unify the people. And so the Tau's deal is that they have a very, very high technology relative to the Imperium. They use combined arms very often. They mix armored battle suits that augment their abilities with high-tech vehicles, with very smart squad-level tactics, things like that. And yes, they're willing to take in other races. There are humans that fight for the Tau. I forget the exact name, but it's something like the Guaylo term from Asian culture to say you're an outsider who's part of us, as it were, to a degree. And there are human forces that fight with them as auxiliaries. Humans have gone, no, you guys are right. This is great. You have a good culture. We're going to work alongside it. And so recently, the Tower become quite a serious thorn in the Imperium side in that way.
Well, are they like a military threat to the Imperium, or is it simply like the power of persuasion in that they could potentially lead humanity to kind of cause a bit of a rift or schism between, worlds where they might defect to the Tau Empire?
Good question. I think they're more of a political threat, as it were.
Sure.
I think they have certainly had military successes against the Imperium. I think sheer numbers says that the Tau would have a hard time holding their own. I mean, it's physically impossible to match the entire of the Imperium's might against the Tau in just fitting in the same space. But that's something the Tau takes advantage of. They capture occasional worlds. They work around the slow bulk of the Imperium. Militarily, I would say they're a danger, but nowhere near as much as they are in terms of, like you say, of turning people away from this ideal and showing them a different way of living.
Well, sure. And then I suppose just to kind of finish up a couple of the last lingering threats, not just necessarily to humanity, but really life itself and the entirety of the galaxy, and for all we know, the entire 40k universe. What exactly is the premise behind the Tyranid race? What is the Great Devourer all about?
Oh my! It arrived yesterday, by the way, at the store. It finally came in. So yeah. The Tyranids. Okay. The Tyranids are a extragalactic life form. They come from outside our galaxy. They are a massive swarm race of various different creatures, all of which form one shared life form. In some ways like the Orc. Orc's an ecosystem that is all one creature, really. All one genetic line.
Right.
They were first officially encountered by the Imperium on the planet Tyrant, which gives us their name. They've come in mostly from the galactic east. I think recently started to move to the south and come up from below the galactic plane. Wow. Space locusts is a good definition. They're a somewhat vaguely insectoid in appearance species. A good way to define them is to say what they do. They enter a planetary system, enter the orbit of a planet, and start to release spores. These are small life forms that are part of their one great biomass. These spores come down and start the process of breaking down organic life on the planet. They make people sick, they fight the bacteria there, they dissolve organic matter like plants and things like that. Then after them becomes the smaller life forms of the Tyranid forces, the small troops such as the Termagants and Hormagants, followed by the larger ones like the Warriors, then by the Hive Tyrants themselves, you get the title in,
Right.
And the various things there. And all these creatures we would view them as an invading military force. They're not. They're harvesters. Their only purpose is to go down to the planet, claim every last resource on it, anything biological or chemical they can use, from breaking down the biomass, the living creatures. If there are humans there, they kill them off and break them down as well, right down to draining the oceans dry. All of this is returned to the hive ships. It's worth noting that most of the time the invading Tyranids are broken down and taken back in a resource form, as it were,
Right.
to the hive ships, the big organisms in orbit. And then these hive ships move on to the next galaxy and continue.
Right. I mean, it's kind of an absolutely fascinating collection of individual organisms all kind of functioning under one giant collective, compelling hive mind will. They're
That's a
all
good point. Yes, they do share a literal a psychic connection that makes them into one distributed intelligence. Yeah, consciousness, as it were. Yeah.
right, right. But I just think it's fascinating that there's no real malice, there's no fear, there's no real emotion. They're just kind of, like you said, locusts driven to fulfill their biological imperative, which is to consume, whether it's water, whether it's atmosphere, carbon, any form of organic life. They're just kind of doing that which they were born to do, and whether it's a biomorph that appears to be like a gun or something that a Tyranid life form is holding, it's all living, it's all biological, it's all kind of this collective of symbiotic species all just working together to fulfill some kind of common purpose.
Mm.
It's a rather fascinating race. I'm rather fond of them myself. I suppose anything else to touch on?
Well, I would say quickly about the Tyranids. The easiest way to define threats in the 40k setting, take chaos. It is just about conceivable that you could deal with chaos. You could talk to them. You could reach some kind of resolution. You can have this planet. We'll lead you to it. There is no dealing with the Tyranids. There is no compromise to be reached. They'll be destroyed, or they'll carry on doing what they do.
Right. And, it's entirely unknown as to how many there are in number. We've started to see some tendrils of the Hive fleets kind of enter our galaxy, but it's entirely unknown as to whether or not we've seen the entirety of the Tyranid forces, or if they've consumed multiple galaxies previous to this one, so just the entire bulk and volume of the Tyranid, if you want to conceptualize it as like a military force. Just no one knows how large it is, and I think there's like one documented instance when, say, the Imperium has managed to actually drive back an invading Tyranid force.
Mm-hmm. Yep, the Ultramarines on Ultramar, when Hive Fleet Behemoth crashed upon its shores. This leads to the Ultramarines being specialists in Tyranid hunting, but the Ultramar was the home world of the Ultramarines, which, if you take up the various chapters they were broken down into, they were originally one of the legions, they're one of the most numerous Space Marine forces around. And yeah, their veterans were almost entirely wiped out in finally driving back the first ever major Tyranid invasion against the Imperium.
Sure. Well, and a little bit earlier on in this interview, you happen to just touch on the Necrons. Certainly, I think the Traxis Sector War Cast is intending to cover them in much greater detail, but do you just want to kind of touch on some of the highlights of that faction that we've yet to see incorporated into this game?
Yeah, I'm interested to see. I'm trying to touch everything here in terms of relating it to the card game, so that newer players have got that link point. And obviously, we know very little about how the Necrons are going to be brought into the Conquest living card game. There's some suggestions that their structure will be unusual in the same way the Tyranids are.
Right.
But in terms of the setting, we mentioned briefly earlier that the Orks were built to fight against them. The Necrons are a particularly ancient race. They were humanoid, physically flesh at some point, until a strange species known as the Catan. I would call them psychic entities, except they seem to be completely the opposite of the warp and antithetical to it. These were powerful, somewhat godlike entities came upon them. The Necrons emerged on planets where life was difficult. Remember correctly, their star was bombarding them with deadly radiation. Their environment was simply hostile and was slowly killing off their species. And the Catan made them an offer that they could help them survive. They agreed to this offer, not fully understanding this offer was to lose their physical bodies and to be put into mechanical skeletal forms, the Necrons we're familiar with now. Yeah, great deal.
Who saw that coming?
Yeah, no kidding. But it left them in this state of enforced immortality. They're an extremely high technology species. After the Catan lost its battle against the Old Ones, through things like the Orks and the Eldar, who fought alongside them, things like that, fought alongside the Old Ones, I should say, the Necrons essentially hibernated and have recently been started to reawaken undead-like on various planets that people had no idea were anything to do with the Necrons, since this was millions of years ago when they originally went to sleep. They have very high technology in a couple of specialized areas. They like to teleport. They have energy weapons that strip things away at the molecular level. They themselves are extremely because they have a mechanical body, they're extremely hard to destroy. And if I remember correctly, they use their teleportation abilities to put themselves into safe areas to repair quickly and to return to battle. So they have that kind of undead feel of being almost impossible to get to stay down. But I've loved the Necrons. They're one of my favourites. I could spend a long time talking about how the most recent version of Necrons, I think, loses some of their mystery and stuff like that, but that's by the by. We'll see what Conquest does with them first. But the original version was essentially just single metallic warriors turning up in strange places that no one had any idea what they were about. Anyway, but yeah, so they are the strange, implacable things that don't seem to have any objectives that we would understand. In a similar way to the Tyranids, no one knows really what they're for, what they're about, and the mystery is the interesting part as we go forward with them.
Well, I suppose really the only last thing I have to ask is, apart from individual tomb worlds where they have been kind of hibernating and laying dormant, are they much of an outright threat to the Imperium, or is it just kind of localized to if you happen to be located at a planet where they have a presence there, where they're starting to reawaken and reemerge, then they, pose a danger to you, but are they organized in any sense? Like, is there a collective Necron military presence?
There are definitely leaders. There are they in our viewpoint they represent the kind of pharaoh kings from Egypt. There are great groups and formations of people. There are various Necrons we've encountered who seem to be willing to be diplomatic to discuss territory. They have this idea that they've re-emerged in their world and gone, well, these are still our worlds, these are still our territory, so we're going to reclaim them. Sure. So they're definitely a danger to the Imperium in that sense, although they can be reasoned with, it appears. One of my favourite ways to kind of describe the Necron threat is to get into an interesting detail about them. We mentioned the Catan earlier, who are antithetical to the warp. Because of that fact, the Catan wanted, and the Necrons need things that can oppose psychers and their influence of the warp. One of the things they've done this is through something called pariahs. The exact nature of pariahs is tricky to really quantify, but they appear to be biological life forms who are psychically blank, who've been formed and changed into a Necron unit, a Necron warrior to fight for them. One of my favourite stories about the Necrons is a very simple one, which is where, out of nowhere, a Necron force attacks a planet. It's not militarily meaningful, it's not strategically important, it doesn't have anything more than a token planetary defense force. It attacks this planet of people. It enters the atmosphere, it storms down to the planet, it obliterates their forces, it focuses down onto one tiny community of people, where at the end of which a Necron lord enters this building full of terrified humans shying away from him, walks in, picks up a single child, cradles it in her arms, turns round, and returns to the fleet and leaves the planet behind, with no other explanation.
Well, I'm at a bit of a loss for words, frankly.
It's one of my favourite parts. That's my favourite part of Necrons, is that mystery and alienness. This inscrutable nature of what they do. I hope to see more of that turn up as they arrive as a playable faction.
Well, for sure. I suppose it might stand to be one of those kind of lore-bending elements in that really all we understand about the Necrons is that they'll be able to, in some sense, ally with any faction. So whether or not that is believable if you approach it from the fiction, if you approach it from the lore, I'm not sure. But certainly there's much that still remains to be made clear about the Necron iteration in our card game, but I suppose before we ultimately bring this video to a close, and once again, thank you so much for your time, Carl, is there anything else you feel like getting off your chest? Any last little bit of detail you feel is worth throwing out there to our listeners?
I'm not sure. I think we did miss one little part there. We should make it look clear. When we're talking about both the the Horus Heresy, the Traitor Legions, and the Warp, is the Chaos Marines that we encounter are the meeting of those two things.
Right.
Those are the Space Marines who were once traitors, mostly the Space Marines who were once traitors, who fled into the Warp. The fall of the Eldar created something called the Eye of Terror, a imposition of the Warp onto our universe, a horrible maelstrom. And a lot of the Chaos Marines use that as an entry point to flee to live on worlds there. Those Chaos Marines that we encounter, things such as Barzul approaching, Zarathur himself, are from that meeting point. They are traitorous Space Marines, just as powerful as the regular Space Marines, yet with the forces of the magics and sorceries of chaos behind them. So they are one of the nastier, individually powerful threats we can encounter.
Right, exactly. As formidable and daunting and as powerful and capable a military presence as the Imperium itself is, and the various Adeptus Astartes legions, the Chaos Space Marines are very much the evil, well, maybe differently evil, demonically manifest versions of those same entities, kind of their mirror presence. And just like a, chaotic primarch like Angron is the chaotic version of Rabaut Guilliman of the Ultramarines, in a sense. They're just, the reflection of humanity in chaos form. But as we bring things to a close, do you want to let people know where they can hear you and ingest all that the Traxis Sector War Cast has to offer?
Certainly, the Traxis Sector War Cast is the podcast hosted by Team Covenant, so you can link to them through their website. We are available on iTunes as well. We have a Twitter and a Facebook presence, Traxis Sector War Cast. I have so much trouble pronouncing that. Traxis Sector War Cast in all those cases. And yeah, please come check us out. I'll do a very, very mild plug. Our podcast recently mentions, since we're on the subject of lore, we're going to be doing a little interesting competition on asking lore questions. So go check our most recent podcast out and see if you've got something interesting to ask us, please.
All right. Well, sounds absolutely fantastic. And Carl, let me tell you, I thought that you would be the go-to person to discuss lore with, and wow, consider me beyond impressed and overwhelmed with not just the volume of knowledge that you understand, but just the speed at which you're able to just gush all of the fiction forth is just immensely impressive. So thank you so much for your time. I hugely appreciate it. And as much as an honor as it has been to have you on, I hope you have an absolutely fantastic evening.
Thank you very much for the chance to come and talk with you about this.
Well, with our interview having drawn to a close, I'll just conclude this video by saying thank you once again for watching, and I very much hope you enjoyed this uniquely lore-centric discussion. Please leave a comment sharing your own thoughts and opinion regarding not just the content of this interview and Carl's presentation of the 40k universe, but also your own most and least favorite aspects of Warhammer lore. Interaction with viewers like you is quite sincerely the absolute highlight of my creating and maintaining content for this channel, and I'm honored to have had the opportunity to share with you this interview today. So, with that said, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you've not done so already, or if you are already subscribed, you're encouraged to share this content, as the more eyes there are on this video, the more potential new players we might draw to this game, and as a result, serve only to ever expand our Conquest community. Please feel free to contact me directly or keep in touch through Twitter or through Facebook, and of course, if at any point you feel so inclined to help me recover some of my operating and file hosting expenses, I'd be honored were you to visit and contribute to my Patreon. But in any case, thank you once again for watching, and as always, be sure to check back in again soon for ever more Conquest LCG content to come.